Our latest book is Hard Facts, Dangerous Half-Truths, and Total Nonsense, Profiting from Evidence-Based Management. And the book is really about two things. First of all, it's about evidence-based management and what evidence-based management is, how to practice it, what it means for companies, and how it can provide some competitive success. And secondly, it's about the various half-truths, the things that are sometimes right but partly wrong, that companies believe in, but that really have bedeviled both companies and organizations and the people who work for them.
And so sometimes people ask us, well, aren't managers now practicing evidence-based management? And it's sort of like medicine. The answer is actually mostly no. What they're doing is they're doing things like what they've always done before. And one of the biggest problems that they have, and in fact all human beings have, is when they believe something, they look for information to support it as being true. And when they don't believe something, almost no amount of evidence will get them to change their mind. So Jeff, maybe you could talk about Gary Loveman and how he overcame the problems in the gaming industry. That's actually a good example of that.
Well, Gary and Harrah's Entertainment, I think, does provide a nice example of evidence-based management, as does the kidney dialysis company DaVita.
Yeah.
And I think both of those examples illustrate a couple of very important principles. In gambling, in the casino and the gaming industry, there was a lot of conventional wisdom, as there is actually in baseball, the subject of the book Moneyball. There's a lot of conventional wisdom about where success and how success came from. Number one, you wanted to attract high rollers, people who spent a lot of money, and you did that, of course, by giving them free rooms and other things like that. Number two, you wanted to build these enormous edifices that look like Luxor or New York City or someplace else. You wanted to make casinos family friendly to get people with their kids to come. And it turns out most of this conventional, and you wanted to, by the way, also do a lot of media advertising, like television advertising and print advertising. And when Gary came in from Harvard Business School, he said, we're not going to rely on any conventional wisdom. What we're going to do is we're going to try to see what is really true. And it turns out what's really true in the gaming industry is that most of the profits come from people who play regularly small amounts in the slot machines for entertainment. And those people are much more likely to be induced to come buy some free chips and maybe a meal than buy free rooms, because they don't need a room. Families with small children, of course, have neither discretionary time nor discretionary income, so you don't want them there. Right. And it turns out spending money on the service experience and spending money on data mining and warehousing so you can actually track your customers and tailor pitches to them is way more profitable than having people come to fancy buildings and have a lousy service experience from people who don't like being there or don't like working there. So they and DaVita really are committed to making decisions based upon the facts.
Well, both companies are actually interesting because they don't accept the assumptions in the industry. They sort of hold belief, and then they do experiments and all sorts of data mining. In fact, I thought some of the experiments at Harrah's with using chips as different incentives were interesting. Another thing about the book, I'm more from the world of engineering. I've got an organizational behavior background, but one thing we've learned from our friends in engineering is that they tend to view products and experiences as prototypes that are always unfinished. So even when a product goes out on the market and they're making money in it, they view it as, well, that's the best we can do right now. And one of the characteristics we found, in fact, Harrah's and DaVita fit this as well, are that they view organizations as something they're constantly in flux and they're constantly fiddling with.
And another thing that those companies have is a phrase that you came up with. It was the attitude of wisdom, which actually comes from Socrates and Plato a long time ago. It is knowing what you know and having enough confidence in what you know that you're able to act, but also having enough doubt and willingness to learn that even as you're acting, you're trying to learn new things as you're trying different things. So that you are continually, it's part of this idea of being an unfinished prototype, that obviously, right, very much like in medicine, you're practicing, but you're learning as you practice, and don't think that you have it mastered, so you're always open to new knowledge. And one of the things that I think gets in the way of managers practicing evidence-based management and leaders practicing evidence-based management is this idea that they think they've got a lot of experience and that they've learned from this experience. And our colleague Andy Harganon said oftentimes, 20 years of experience is not 20 years of experience. Right. It's 1 year of experience repeated 20 times. And one of the things, if you're really going to learn from experience, which I think is really important, is you have to be open to reflecting and taking the time to reflect and think and go back and be willing to change.
Well, and a lot of that attitude of wisdom is striking this balance between overconfidence and underconfidence. So it's having the confidence to act on what you know and the humility to actually learn from new things that happen. And it's sort of interesting because one of the things we've learned in studying organizations that are effective at actually learning from experience is that the leaders are actually very action-oriented, but they actually pretty quickly, when something goes wrong, admit their mistakes and say what they've learned from it. So some of the ones, Kevin Rollins, who's now CEO of Dell, is actually quite good about admitting mistakes that they've made and then moving forward. And Andy Grove is quite good as well. And you also mentioned Gary Loveman, who, when they put in a lousy health insurance plan, ran around the company and said, "It's not HR's fault, it's my fault, we learned from it, we won't do this to you again." And I think that flies in the face of what many people sort of believe and learn, that if they should never admit a mistake, both either to themselves or to other people. And that's also related to the attitude of wisdom, and also facing the hard facts, actually updating based on what you learn.
And part of that is not just admitting mistakes, but it's also admitting what you don't know. I think a lot of leaders today think that they need to get through life by basically blustering. And so if you get asked a question and you really don't know the answer, you make something up. And one of the things that I think you'll see with both Gary and Ken Thiry at DaVita and a lot of these folks, and the David Kelly, a lot of these other folks, is that when they're asked a question that they don't know, they'll say, "We don't know, but we'll go find out and we will get back to you." And that signals to the organization that it's okay to admit what you don't know. And if you don't admit what you don't know, it's impossible to learn anything new because you're never open to really learning.
It's sort of interesting because there's another saying. This actually comes from Carl Weick, who's done a lot of writing on wisdom, and his argument is, and I think this is quite effective and it's hard for all of us to learn, is you should argue like you're right, but listen as if you're wrong. And I think that's also related to the sort of attitude of wisdom. And in fact, Intel, with their famous constructive confrontation model, that's very much the training that every full-time employee gets. And I think that's right for facing the hard facts. If you look at all the research, just about everything in popular culture over-exaggerates the influence of leaders. That we give them too much credit when things go wrong. We give them too much credit when things go right. Too much blame when things go wrong.
And too much money all the time.
And too much money all the time. They're not worth 500 or 1,000 times the average employee. That's certainly the case. So on one hand, that's true. On the other hand, you don't get to get a job as a CEO or keep it, or even a manager of a small group, if you don't convince people that you're in charge. And so that's a dilemma, which is that on one hand, you don't have that much control, but if you admit it, you don't get the job in the first place and you have no control at all. And we were just talking about Andy Grove. So Andy Grove has this sort of great quote that we actually got from an interview that he did with Clay Christensen, where he said, essentially, you've got to act like you know what you're doing, even though you very well don't know what you're doing. And I think there is maybe a touch of hypocrisy in that, but when you look at great leaders, there's so much uncertainty. To sort of calm people down and go in a direction to figure out actually if it's wrong, you've got to act like you're in charge.
You would run from a doctor who doesn't act with a certain amount of certainty and self-assurance, but on the other hand, that doctor has to also be honest with you and honest with themselves about what they know and what they don't know.
And it's interesting, the difference between doctors and medicine. Very often when people sell you something like, I'm thinking of enterprise software or something like a new HR system, they don't tell you what the risks and problems are. And in medicine, that actually turns out to be malpractice. And I think that's one of the things that we're pushing for is in people in the world who buy products, services and anything from management consulting firms and from other vendors, should be obligated to ask what the risks are, and the people who sell it should be obligated to say what the problems are.
One of the problems with management practice is that people take what is essentially maybe a good idea or insight, and they carry it to such an extreme that there is no concept of like the happy medium, or that a little bit is good and more is better, and then the more beyond that you hit the point of diminishing returns. And another example of that is really the issue of rewards and incentives. George Zimmer of the Men's Warehouse, when he came to my class and talked about the case we had written on the Men's Warehouse, I thought made some of the most perceptive comments. He said, you want the reward, when you give a team a reward or give a group a reward or an individual reward, you want the reward to be significant enough that it is an occasion for celebration, But you don't want the reward to be so big that it actually distorts their behavior.